Sebastian Berger, thank you very much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS. It's a real pleasure for us to have you join us today to speak about ecological economics.
Thanks for having me.
Well, before we get into the detail of the school of thought and what it covers and its assumptions and all the things that underlie, what got you into being an ecological economist in the first place?
So I think I need to get back to 20 years ago when I was introduced to the works of Carl William Kapp on the issue of social costs, and basically this idea that the rationality of capitalism is incomplete or flawed, that they don't account for full costs. And then obviously the question, how do you remedy that? And the critique of the mainstream economic solutions to that problem. And so meaning Pigu's taxation proposal, how to remedy that, and then the alternative view that you need to have more ecological economics-based approaches. And basically this question of how to introduce a different kind of economic thinking has kept me going for the past 20 years. And my thinking was that we need to transport this into academia, where this thinking is reproduced. And so my conscious effort was to contribute to this movement of heterodox economics or ecological economics in the academia to get a different economic thinking from the ground up, so that we don't just deal with the consequences of bad thinking, but actually change the thinking where it's reproduced.
Mentioned ecological economics as a heterodox school of thought. Would you like to start by giving us an idea of the kind of assumptions that underpin ecological economics, and maybe what makes it different from other schools?
Yeah, okay. So first off, some people would disagree that ecological economics is heterodox. There's some leading ecological economists who say that it's not heterodox because heterodoxy does not take up enough of the ecological economics ideas. Nevertheless, I think it's heterodox because it, going off this notion that the dividing line is sort of this critique of neoclassical economics. So ecological economics disagrees with significant amounts of this mainstream neoclassical framework and other versions of neoliberal economics that may make up the mainstream. And so I'd say it's heterodox enough. And so one of the key ideas is obviously the idea that the economy is not a closed system. So based on this idea from thermodynamics, ecological economics is a thoroughly scientific, modernist approach to understanding the economy through scientific understanding. And that takes from thermodynamics and physics. And that is clearly different from the neoclassical version, where the economy is perceived as a closed system of a circular flow of money and goods and services that can go on forever and grow forever. And this key idea is undermined once you incorporate thermodynamics. According to ecological economics, it's sort of, I would say, the bedrock of the work that Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen introduced in 1971 with his very important book, The Economic Process and the Entropy Law. And I think from this perspective, everything changes. Once you adopt this thermodynamics perspective, you can no longer really subscribe to neoclassical economics. But here we already have a problem, because this points to certain fissures or fragmentations within the ecological economics movement, because some people say that neoclassical economics is flexible enough to couch ecological ideas within it. And so there's debates within the movement, within the community, within the field, how to actually deal with this mainstream neoclassical economics domination of the economics discipline. Should you reject it completely, or should you try to have an evolutionary approach where you couch important ideas of limits and optimal scale and sustainable scale within an existing, so that you have a better way to transform the discipline rather than a revolution, having an evolution. And so there are ongoing debates about that. But I would say I'm more on the radical side. I would say that the neoclassical framework really cannot be used anymore once you accept the notion of an open system, an open thermodynamic system.
That's a really good kind of overview. That you've mentioned thermodynamics a couple of times. Would you like to just tell us the importance of those kind of two laws of thermodynamics within ecological economics, and what those two laws are, and how they impact the idea of an economy that can grow continuously?
Yeah, so there are several laws of thermodynamics, and the most important is the second law in terms of economics. The entropy law is the idea that all life on the biophysical level is a transformation process of matter and energy, and the physics of that is thermodynamics, so that if you want to have a life process, then you need to use low entropy resources to maintain a steady state, to maintain a life process. And in the end, you have a high entropy. And this is a irrevocable process in the sense that it flows only from low entropy to high entropy. So you have an irrevocable process which you cannot reverse through some kind of perpetuum mobile, perfect cycle, recycling cycle. Here the assumption is you can't do that, or the understanding is you can't do that because of this second law of thermodynamics. And of course, there's a debate, and there's always been a debate whether this is a correct application of thermodynamics within economics. Some physicists, for example, disagree. They say that you cannot apply thermodynamics to the question of matter. It only applies to energy. So critiques surrounding this very important issue. However, there are other physicists who say it is a valid transfer because it does speak to significant empirical evidence that matter does irreversibly fragment in terms of soil erosion, for example. When we use agricultural fields, then you have the runoff in the water, and that is so highly dispersed a matter that no amount of time or energy will bring that back into pristine topsoil. So it's just irrevocably lost. And this was one of the key arguments by Berger. Another example is the tires, the car tires he gave, that when you drive, this matter from the car tires gets so highly dispersed in the environment that there is no energy or time for this to ever be collected back into a car tire. And so this is irrevocably lost low entropy matter. And the problem with that is obviously then, and this is the whole concern, is you have a problem with resources. So if you are in an irrevocable process, you have the question, how many resources do we still have available? Number one, the constraint in terms of input, but then also the output question, how much pollution can the environment possibly absorb before it gets uninhabitable? So you have the two questions that emerge from this fundamentally different way of looking at the economy.
So that really puts our constraints on how much we can reuse and recycle. And what we're saying is we could be the best that we could possibly be at that, but eventually we're still going to get a position where those materials cannot be used again. What does that neoclassical view, when you look at the economy from that perspective, what does that concern? Does that have a concern about matter and energy transformation? Or
well, the neoclassical production function dropped the question of land and natural resources about 140 years ago or so. And so basically the assumption now is that labor and capital can reproduce the economy and can sustain economic growth in and of themselves, as capital is a human-made capital is a perfect substitute for natural capital, for anything that comes from nature. And this is basically neoclassical theory, and it's, in my view, it's unrealistic. It doesn't correspond to the facts of reality, and so it's in clear contradiction to how ecological economists see the world. And just to add to that, the implication of this is degrowth. So and degrowth is not a policy proposal, it's not a moral stance, it is a scientific necessity once you adopt the notion that the economic process is entropic. Degrowth in a closed material system, that is a finite closed material system, Earth, a spaceship Earth is a metaphor that Kenneth Boulding adopted for it, then degrowth is an inevitability. Then you can just discuss, when do you want to have degrowth, now or later? How fast do you want to have degrowth? And so we are in a degrowth paradigm, and neoclassical economics is clearly a growth paradigm. They are interested in how you can have more growth quicker, expanding the cyclical flow of money, goods, and services. And this is assumed to be going on forever. This is unscientific, perceived as unscientific.
That's a distinct difference, isn't it? When I look at ecological economics, and it sees it within this kind of steady state paradigm compared to this growth, this perpetual growth. And I often say it's degrowth. It's by design or by disaster. That's the situation we have when we look at our economy. Is there any other distinct differences that you think places within ecological economics that's different from other schools? You've mentioned this kind of concept of an open system, and this kind of entropy, which leads us to a situation where we can't have perpetual growth. Are there any other key foundations for ecological economics?
From the way I interpret the ecological economics field, I think it's thermodynamics and the idea of the open system economy. These are the key foundations. Of course, later economists have added to that. So the students of Jajeska-Rogan have added other things. They have put the emphasis on slightly different aspects. So if you take Daly, Herman Daly's contribution was to emphasize more the steady state aspect, so that in a sense you emphasize more the possibility of having a constant economy for long enough that it almost seems like it is a very long or potentially infinite time horizon where we are steady state, to de-emphasize the degrowth aspect. So again, depending on which part of ecological economics you subscribe to, which group or subgroup within it, you're going to emphasize different things. But I stay as close as possible to what I think is the contribution of highest quality, which is by Nicholas Jajeska-Rogan, and I simply take this scientific stance.
I often, when I'm reading stuff on ecological economics, I'm a little bit confused about where ecological economists see the role of technology. And I know that a lot of people kind of say that, ecological economics is kind of Luddite in nature, that it looks at technology as being something that's really damaging rather than something that can help us. And then I read other things where it's saying actually technology is one of the ways that we can help push the boundaries out and can have an economy that is a kind of steady state and a well-being economy. What's your views on the role of technology within modern economy?
Yeah, well, it's clear that technology is key to changing the way we interact with nature. So you can adopt technologies that are less consuming of low entropy resources. So you can choose technologies that use the existing stock and funds of resources very quickly or more slowly. So in that sense, technology is clearly a key variable next to institutions and structures that you can adjust. But I would say again that technology is not a moral stance. It's a bit like we are free as humans to decide which speed of transformation we want to engage in. Technology is one variable in it. And whether, Jajeska-Rogan said very clearly, whether or not we're going to choose the technologies that are more recyclable, that give us more recyclable waste, or not, or whether we choose technologies that use up, big cars. He gave examples of, producing big cars and golf carts and big houses where we have to overheat and overcool. This is our choice. And ultimately, if you read his bioeconomic program, which I don't see cited a lot, unfortunately, but he says that it's an open question. It's a test to humanity, who we are. Are we a type of species that decides to have a short and exciting life, or a longer, more boring life in terms of transforming resources? These are really the two options. And we might reveal ourselves to be a species that prefers a short, very exciting life. And This is still an open question. There's no moral stance involved here. Of course, I would like us personally, this is my preference, I would like us to have perhaps a longer and less wasteful existence. But on the whole, I'm not so sure if that's what we are currently revealing ourselves to be. But I don't think that, that the ecological economists have an anti-technology stance. In fact, the focus is on adjusting technology in a smart way, to have more recyclable waste, to have less pollution. This is actually all about taking an innovative stance, a pro-technology stance, if you will. Let's get, let's innovate, let's change the technologies we've had for 100 years that are extremely wasteful. I'm talking about oil and gas, in particular, the paradigms after World War II that were introduced, the oil-dependent age, really, globally. And I think it's not an anti-technology stance at all. It might be portrayed that way, but I don't. The question is also, I think that you need to ask. It's not just what is the framework, but also why is it not more successful? Why is it not being taken up? Why is it having so much resistance? If the scientific facts are clear, and they've been clear for a very long time, and Georges Grogan wrote about this in the 1950s, and so did others like Boulding and Carl William Kapp, who I've studied a lot. Then the question is really where are the barriers to adjusting, where are the barriers to adopting these scientific insights? And we see this currently at the moment as well with the climate change discussions. It's not so clear whether this is just about gaining dominance in the discourse or whether there are even other behavioral resistances to it. I mean, I've been teaching this for 20 years, ecological economics, and you sometimes do wonder whether there are emotional, psychological barriers as well amongst the audience to taking on board notions of finiteness, notions of degrowth, because they contradict fundamentally cultural precepts that have been deeply ingrained, and people have gotten used to that in Western capitalist cultures. And so I think there's some underlying issues that are not per se scientific that we're running up against here. And then the question is, as in many civilizations before, whether or not a civilization can adjust its beliefs or cultural precepts quickly enough to conform with scientific facts concerning the survival necessities. And some civilizations have failed in that regard, and there's a potential that we will fail as well.
Yes. Who are the other scientists or writers who've influenced you, who you think would be good sources for people to move on to?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, the work of Carl William Kapp has been influential because I came from a you could say neoliberal background, studying business and investment banking. But when I discovered that the rationality of the capitalist balance sheet is incomplete, and that makes it not just incomplete, but flawed and potentially irrational, I paused and I started to think, well, is that really the case? And is that really a robust critique? And then, you really look into it, you look into how capitalist double entry bookkeeping works, and you realize, yes, it's only accounting for financial capital. It is treating everything else just as an asset, so it can undercut the cost, the replenishment costs of the other assets like nature and human beings, so not paying full costs that would be sustainable costs to let these factors of production reproduce themselves in the long run. And as a result, you get non-full cost pricing. So the whole price system is flawed. The price system does not reflect the full reproduction cost. And then you really start to ask yourself a question: is capitalism just a balance sheet fraud? You have numbers that suggest a very correct, a very accounting science correct system, but it's not. It's flawed. And then you start to ask some deeper questions. We're guiding the economy based on these flawed numbers. And so this is, I think, a very strong critique from within is accounting, critical accounting studies, as well as the economics of Carl William Kapp, which was strong enough as a critique to sort of bring me around to no longer follow the the neoliberal ideology on this and see the flaws in it. But there's another economist I would like to mention. That's E.F. Shoemaker. E.F. Shoemaker published a book in 1973, Small is Beautiful. And E.F. Shoemaker has a very similar critique that accounting is inaccurate. Again, it's treating a capital depletion as income. So you're just depleting resource, you're cutting down a forest, you're depleting an oil field, and you treat that as income instead of capital depletion. And you're not accounting for depreciation costs and replenishment costs and reinvestment costs of equal substitute resources. So and then
could you explain what impact, because I think that's such an important point, Sebastian, could you explain what impact that has when we don't account for that? You know, and I'll just kind of precede that a little bit by saying GDP measures the income that we have that year, or the increase in the amount of income or consumption or production we have that year, but it doesn't account for anything about the resources used and the depletion of those resources to generate that income. So could you explain the kind of fundamental problem with that perception of the economy, or the accounting on the economy?
Basically, it's a wealth delusion. If you account the destruction of existing and lasting wealth in the sense of renewable resources, but if you count that as just income, this depletion, then you have you could say a wealth illusion. You are essentially eliminating the sources of your longevity, but you're counting it as income, and then you think you're doing well, but you're actually doing the opposite. And this is a fundamental problem. It has been noticed by many economists since the 1930s. Keynes talked about it, Kapp talked about it, Shoemaker talked about it, and his famous book calls renewed attention to it, that we either have to change accounting, or if we can't change accounting because of institutional lock-ins, because capitalist accounting profession is very strong and they will resist the changes in international accounting standards, then well, what is alternative? And Shoemaker argued that, okay, if we can't change capitalism, its core institutions, let's at least change scale. So let's try to go back to smaller scales. So his book, Small is Beautiful, emphasizes that we need to get away from economies of scale and return to the local economy, local cycles, local production. And so this could be a focus on scale as opposed to changing capitalism. You know, so you could have a local capitalism. Then you would still reduce scale, but through a local economy, rather than trying to undermine the institutions of capitalism. It would still be private property, money, markets, keep accounting potentially the same way, but let's reduce it to local scale. That was his proposal. And so Shoemaker had a massive impact as well. So these are the key authors I would point to: Small is Beautiful and Kapp's Social Costs of Private Enterprise, that certainly were very influential on me.
Yeah, I know for a lot of people at the moment, a real good introduction to ecological economics is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, and Jason Hickel. I know those are two authors who've got quite popular books as an introduction to ecological economics, as well as, you know, separate from a lot of the academic and the scientific literature you've covered there. One of the other things I notice about ecological economics is an understanding of the difference between a stock and a flow. And I think ecological economists tend to concentrate quite a lot on what's happening with the stock. And I think that kind of neoclassical economists are focused on this idea of the flow. Is that a fair assumption? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, they confound a lot of the issues because they are not interested in nature. And ecological economists say as soon as you care about different types of resources, you have to recognize that not all resources have the same growth potential and the same productive potential, and there are constraints. And for instance, you can't think of a forest or an ecosystem in the same way you think of a stock of oil in the ground. And they don't have the same maximization potential. You can maximize the flow from an oil field without jeopardizing the oil field, let's say. but you can't do that with an ecosystem. Ecosystem has different constraints. So ecological economists think of fund ecosystem services and funds as something that is subject to growth constraints in a very different way from stocks of resources, which you can, based on your technologies, turn into a flow, which you can maximize, and you can have short-run growth very quickly and highly, and that's what we've been doing. But if you try the same with ecosystems and living systems, sentient systems, creatures like fish, for example, or forests, then you are likely to destroy them very quickly, and they enter these self-destruction spirals. And then you just, what we're witnessing the decline of biodiversity and the self-destruction of various ecosystems. Once they hit the tipping points, they go into this free fall, free decline. And ecological economists have described that the limits to growth are much sooner. They're much before you reach the end of oil. And this has been scientific, at least in ecological knowledge, for many decades. And we are seeing these constraints now coming up very, very quickly. And it's nothing new. But again, neoclassical economists don't know that. They can't talk about it because they don't have a natural capital or resources in the production function. And that's the cause of that is ideological.
Yeah. If we're looking at ecological economics as a kind of school of thought, are there any policies that have come out of that school that are having any major impact or influence on how we're managing our economy at the moment?
Yeah, I would say all policies that try to recycle more, it's at the basic level. I understand we've been trying to recycle more for a long time now, but recycling is one issue, because the more you recycle, the less waste you have and the fewer resources you use. You could say any recycling policy that is adopted or has been adopted or proposed is already a recognition of this. The Chinese and CAP's work in the 1970s points this out. The Chinese and the environmental planning policies in the early 1970s was already pointing to this idea of zero waste. So reuse all the waste, to have zero waste. This was quite an aspirational Chinese policy at the time, and it was more forward thinking than now. I don't know if you can have zero waste necessarily, because it contradicts the law of thermodynamics, but at least there's an aspiration or formulation that was more forward thinking than what the West had at the time. And but so recycling is one aspect, but the other aspect is, I think, and I always like to emphasize, is you actually have to have a philosophic transformation of the Western mindset ultimately, because I don't think that recycling itself is gonna do it. I don't think that flying less is gonna do it. I think ultimately it points to the question of whether the fundamental precepts of Western civilization can be upheld. And someone like Shoemaker believed that you need to change the ethics, the morality, in order to
values
support,
that we have.
Yeah, in order to support the scientific insights, because scientific insights by themselves seem to not be enough to change it around. And so this might point in the direction of having to change educational frameworks. How do we educate the young generation with regard to nature? And Shoemaker College, for instance, in the south of England, Shoemaker College is trying to have a different approach to knowledge, different approach to education. So it could be an educational reform that's required. But defossilizing, so the movements we see at the moment to defossilize, to keep the oil in the ground, the last generation, the Fridays for Future movements, I think they're all pushing in the direction that is supported by the understanding that better degrowth slowly rather than catastrophically in a few years. So I think we have societal support for this strongly at the moment. The question is just, can it be implemented into concrete policies? And there seems to be a breakdown often that is being pointed out. We have the Greens in power in Germany, but as these social movements point out, the Greens are falling short of their own promises. They're falling short of doing what's required. And there is a breakdown at the policy level that indicates that we're probably not going to avoid more catastrophic, sudden tipping point types of changes, which again were predicted by ecological economists as a consequence of not acting sooner, not reducing growth sooner.
One really important point I would like to highlight there, Sebastian, is what you're saying is that ecological economists, going back to, let's say, the limits of growth in the early 1970s, have been saying that these things will happen. And on the other side, the kind of, the neoclassical side, they've been saying, no, these things won't happen because we can always advance in such a way to mitigate all of those costs. And if you're looking at a school of economics to predict a future as the first step to being able to deal with it, I think ecological economics is on quite a solid ground within that situation. There was one policy that I just wanted you to briefly cover, and this is cap and trade, which I often read as being a very important concept within ecological economics. So could you just briefly explain if you think this is really important, and is this an example of where ecological economics has had a success, but that success actually hasn't played out in what we'd have all hoped for? And I'm talking specifically about kind of carbon and kind of cap and trade and carbon markets.
Yeah, this is a great question. As far as I know, cap and trade is not an outgrowth of ecological economics school of thought. The people I talk to, the way I teach it, it's actually perceived as a distraction and more sort of a neoliberal domain shift. So if the scientific insight is we need degrowth, which challenges the fundamentals of our society, it could be a neoliberal strategy to shift the discourse, have another domain, and talk about how we can make a market, yet again, a market where we commodify something, where all the talk shifts not to degrowth, but what is the technique and mechanism of commodifying waste, commodifying CO2 emissions, and how to get these mechanisms right is a price adjustment in a market. It doesn't question fundamentals of accounting. It doesn't question fundamentals of growth ideology. It's a pretension that by getting prices right, you can fix the world. And this is a very neoclassical, neoliberal if you count Coase into Ronald Coase, his article 1960, the problem of social cost. If you count that into the neoliberal framework, some people dispute that, say not a neoliberal, but okay, if you do that, then the idea that you can trade CO2 and get prices right and solve the problem, this, I would say, is thoroughly neoclassical / neoliberal. I would not count that as a success of ecological economics. And we see it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And now the prices are going to explode with the new, carbon pricing. And then we will see backlash again. It's not going to work. They're going to change it. They're going to intervene in these markets like they've done in the last 20 years. They're going to try. These mechanisms will, in my realistic assessment, not work to get us where we need to be. It's a, a distraction. And so, but on the other hand, there are serious people I know who say, well, it's at least something, we should be happy for it, because at least if we assume it's going to work, then it's a tool that is going to take out the corruption of the politicians who always adjust according to political whim and will in the short run adjust the targets. At least here we have a mechanism that is run in a very bureaucratic, expert rule kind of way that is taken out of the control of politicians, and we can have an automatic system that increases prices, and price adjustment is key to get people to change behavior. If flights become very expensive, then they will not fly anymore. And so at least we can use these neoliberal tools, even if we are not neoliberals, we should agree with it in order to have at least a little bit of a positive contribution. But it's for, I wouldn't call it an ecological economics. Vision in the school of thought that I find appealing and attractive is that you look more into institutional adjustments instead of fixing markets and fixing prices, and that you can do a lot on the structural, institutional, technological side through planning, whether it's on local level or central government level, where you adjust, the amount of public transport available, for instance. So if there's more public transport available and it's available cheaply, so it's equitable, socially equity and fairness is guaranteed, then you can also bring down CO2 emissions. So it's a structural adjustment, public provisioning of public goods that can bring down the CO2 emissions without having to tinker with the global or European, the complexities of an undemocratic, expert-driven, large-scale CO2 trading scheme and hope for changes there. You can do something at the local level, open cycling lanes, prohibit driving in certain areas or limit driving in certain areas where pollution is high through, these schemes we have here in the UK where you introduce a low emission zones and no parking zones, and you make it easier to cycle, and you can do these structural adjustments. I think is something that overall economics profession does not really like to talk about that much, because it's harder to teach, it's more case-based, it's more learning from local examples, it's a different methodology. Economics is taught in a very abstract, formal-based, mathematical way, and you can't really talk about these hands-on structural adjustments in this way. So they like much more to talk about price mechanisms and the formulas, and this is a very abstract rather than case-based approach. But I lean more towards these practical local solutions. They seem to work better and maybe also account for the issue of democracy better, because the CO2 scheme, I think, lacks democratic foundations. It's just expertocracies. It's experts in Brussels running for us our price mechanism, impacting all of our lives, and we have then no chance really to even understand or vote them out, what they're doing, changing what they're doing. We're giving up control. We can control a lot of these things at the local level, or could, through structural changes. So the institutional school of thought really emphasizes this a lot more, and I think Shoemaker is strong on that. Carl William Kapp is strong on that. How you can get to the same result or better result through structural, technological, and institutional adjustments. I'll give an example with solar energy. Solar panels were installed in the early 1970s and subsidized. And this would have been one way if we didn't have the conservative turnaround in the early 1980s. But if we had followed on with these policies in the 1970s, technological innovation into solar power, we probably wouldn't be talking about a CO2 emissions trading scheme right now. We would have already been 30, 40 years into a solar economy. Solar panel-driven economy, renewable economy. So these things are, I think, much more important to focus on.
Can you explain why you're involved in updating an economics textbook, and give us a little bit of more information on that, and why you think that's so important?
Yeah, obviously, one of the primary motivations for me to become an economist was to cause this change within economics as a discipline, within the university, to change thinking from the ground up for the next generation. And I had to learn a lot on the way. It's not so easy as I thought, because you run up against many lock-ins and barriers, like the textbook market. The textbook market dominates the way economics is taught. So the publishers with the market coverage or market share, they're all neoclassicals. So 80-90% of textbooks in the whole world are sold. They're all neoclassical. So if you want to change economics, you can't really do it unless you have alternative textbooks, because you often need a textbook. Students want a textbook. Universities demand that you have textbooks for exercises, for reading materials. So textbooks are key to changing how economics is taught. And we've been involved in this textbook project that's open source, so it's for free essentially, and we're hoping that this may encourage people to adopt it, or students to read it more, because they don't have to pay that much money for it, because textbooks have become very expensive in the recent past. It's very profitable for publishers, and we are hoping that with this open source textbook we can make a difference, and we teach it from an ecological institutional perspective in this textbook, but we also present the mainstream argument and we present critiques of the mainstream argument. And we hope that this approach, this critical debate approach to contending perspectives, ultimately is a good way to teach it, not just teach a dogma, but teach a debate, because there, in a sense, there is learning in debating. And you understand more sides of the issue, and that's how we like to teach it. The textbook does get adopted quite widely in the US. We've done some research. It's being adopted. We'd hope it will get adopted even more. We've just updated the 3rd edition with a team of people in the US and the UK. And yeah, we're hoping to make a difference.
Sebastian, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful introduction, and hopefully between the two of us inspired more people to at least look into some of the ideas within the broad, as we've found out today, quite broad school of ecological economics. Have you got any final comments before we head off?
Oh, that's it, William. Thanks so much for having me. Thanks for the opportunity, and I hope that the listeners will learn something from it, and with good outcome.
Thanks so much. Bye for now.
Thanks. Bye.